We're now live on YouTube with the May 6th edition of the Node.js modules team. Got about 8 of us on the call. We've got a decent agenda. So let's kick it right off. The first thing that we have on here is CLI, dev flag for development exports resolution conditions. This is a pull request by Guy. Is there anyone else who knows it well that would be able to lead the discussion for this?
I can, I guess.
Do we want to do it without Guy here?
I believe this is just discussion. It's not us making any decisions, is it?
Yeah, I mean, or we could maybe go out of order in case Guy joins later. I don't know.
Out of order seems fine.
Okay, so we're gonna skip this topic for now and come back if, oh, we've got an attendee, Evan. Good to see you, Evan. So let's start with the backport unflagged experimental modules for V12. I can introduce this one and then we can talk. I don't know if it's going to be a huge discussion. So we had discussed as a group for a while about unflagging on 12 in Assembler Minor. We had talked about that a bunch. Now, that Assembler Minor got delayed. It was originally supposed to be at the end of April, and now it's in May in a couple weeks. So we're coming close to the release of it, and we have, you know, we're at the point now where we can update. What I think we're waiting on now is just consensus on a few tiny bits here. So one thing that we need to reach consensus on is like, are we cool with backporting the removal of the flag? And this is something that, you know, the release team and to an extent the TSC needs to be on the same page of as well. The other thing is, are we okay with backporting the flag with or without the warning? And so I have had a conversation with a couple folks, and I want to make a discrete proposal, and then, you know, we could see if we could reach consensus on it. And this is based on conversations I've had with people on the TSC. I think that it's good for us to backport. I think it's good for us to remove the flag. This is, you know, a good way to push adoption. But I don't think that we should be removing the warning for ESM. Now we've removed the other warnings. So we've removed the warning now for self-referential modules as well as for conditional exports. So that no longer warns. But I do think that we should maintain the experimental modules warning, at least up until the point that 14 goes into LTS. So that would be targeting, you know, around October, late October, for us to remove the warning. Part of the reason for this is, you know, like removing the warning on 14. 14 is currently the current branch. It is not yet LTS. People using it in production come with kind of like the warnings of what it means to run current in production. I don't feel comfortable myself, and I know others feel the same way, in giving that same kind of like signal of support and adoption to LTS yet. Jordan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, so when I originally saw your comments on the PR, I think it was, I was like taken aback because I misunderstood, I think, what you were talking about. So just after some conversations with you, I wanted to clarify like that with your proposal, Miles, anyone using require will see no warnings, no matter what, even if the thing they're requiring uses exports or conditional exports.
Yes.
Cool. So the only people then who would see warnings are people using dynamic import or ESM with static import. And like, that seems fine to me. I prefer not to have the warning, but because to me, unflagged is like if we're looking for adoption, then warnings hinder adoption because package authors won't use it. But like, but as long as it's just in ESM, I think that's probably fine.
And for what it's worth, like that hindering of adoption is actually kind of the point. Like we don't want to give too strong of a signal yet. And I think some of the feedback that we've received from people so far related to ESM, people are still learning how to use it. There are rough edges. They're kind of like skinning their knees, learning to ride a bike a bit. I think it is a little early to remove the warning on LTS. And I think if we tried to push for that, we're going to get pushback from the TSC and from other folks within core who may not be comfortable with that. So with this as like a high level proposal, Corey, you have your hand up?
Yes, I just wanted to say my only concern with this is some packages might be using dynamic import to detect support for ESM. So by unflagging it and putting the warning, we could end up causing warnings to be produced in the case of, for example, a package detecting if it's able to load an ESM-based config file. I'm not sure how big of an issue that is, but I just wanted to raise it.
Wouldn't the same packages right now just not even work trying to use dynamic import?
Well, yes, that's the point, is right now they're detecting if dynamic import can be used. And right now it either fails or it doesn't. And what you're proposing would make it so that the detection would pass, but it would produce a warning, possibly even if, there isn't any ESM in the loop.
So you're saying in the case where they're using a form of eval to determine if the import syntax works, and then they're try catching that?
Yes, or requiring a CJS file which doesn't import to.
And then it throws if it's.
I'll have to double check NYC's current loader, but I actually might be doing that.
I think that's the same situation we had like recently with 14 and 13, isn't it? When we first removed the flag, but then removed the warning later.
That's kind of what I was concerned about in lighter terms for ESM only, but like essentially if the whole point of the warning is to give, in my opinion, actionable feedback that something somebody's doing is unstable. So, meaning either accept the risks or don't do that. And in top level code, that's exactly what it does, right? Like that's totally fine. And in code where the instant you try to use a package, you get it, then you don't use that package. But if it's in a transitive dependency, or if it's something the package is trying to do dynamically, then you have nothing you can do about that warning except learn to ignore warnings, which is generally not something we want. Or you will not use any package that has those warnings because there's no way for you to avoid them, which means that the package authors will just not use the features, which means we're not getting any of the feedback we want, or that whole class of feedback we want. And that's kind of like the trade-offs, I guess, of like removing the flag to me is a much stronger signal than removing the warning. I would like, to me, warnings are ignorable. They don't matter. They're just kind of like, I hope you see this, but like the flag is the gate.
Yeah, but I guess to that point, like removing the flag makes it easier for people to adopt. Keeping the warning stops people from adopting it en masse, which is actually like the purpose of kind of like creating these waterfalls. Corey, a question to you, just kind of thinking about it out loud. You would be able to use in a common JS module, like require with the self-referential name as a way to check for ESM support, but that should not trigger the warning. Would that maybe be able to be used instead of the dynamic import solution that you're using?
Just to, I just double checked for the NYC code, and essentially I have a separate load ESM CJS file which performs dynamic import, and that file is only loaded if somebody tries to load a .mjs config file. At this time, we don't support loading JS config that has ESM in it. So realistically for NYC, no warning will be produced unless they're actually using ESM. I guess my
That seems
concern,
appropriate.
other packages might not have taken the same approach I did. And I
Mhm.
Well,
have,
and go ahead.
I have seen the suggestion before that basically, why don't you just use dynamic import and fall back on require if that fails? So I guess that's my concern.
So the other thing is, Miles, to your question, like, so I have a package called has package exports that basically tells you if the exports field is respected in your current version of Node. It would be trivial for me to make another one for like has self-referential or whatever, but like all of that tells you is whether you can use that feature. It doesn't necessarily tell you about ESM, depending on what you're trying to do with it, right? Like if you're trying to avoid the warning, it won't tell you if there's a warning. It'll only tell you if it works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess the reason I've been looking at self-referential as the way to do this is like you can try catch it, it will fail and get caught. It doesn't require syntax that old versions of Node doesn't support, and all versions of Node that support ESM without a flag support self-referential without a flag, and self-referential wasn't in flag before. So I think that's the right way to sniff it myself, although people have done hacky things to support self-referential modules before, like installing yourself, that could make things weird. There was another one that Richard Lau brought up that I think is worth considering, which is if anyone who's not currently opting into ESM, but maybe using dependencies that will change differently once the flag's removed. So like once the flag is removed, any dependency that was being required that was previously using the main entry point will all of a sudden start using the exports entry point. And so I think that there's like a question about if removing this flag is semver major. I still don't think it is, but I'd love to get folks' 2 cents on that.
Did we already do any removal for the conditional exports in 12? They're still warning, right?
There's in 12.16.3, there's no more warning for self-referential or for conditional exports. We removed those warnings. But I don't believe, I could be wrong, but I believe that exports works, but conditional exports is still, and self-referential are still behind the flag. So they're not on. So people can have an export.
In Node 12, the exports field I don't think works at all right now. Are you talking about with that PR?
I could be wrong, but I thought the exports field worked. It just didn't support conditional exports. We could test that really quick.
Yeah, I can check that real quick.
My feeling is if there isn't conditional export support, I would not see it as breaking, because the presumption, at least my presumption, is people would have written that support pointing to CommonJS at the time. With conditional exports, it's a little bit more confusing to me.
The exports field doesn't work in Node 12 at all, Miles. They're all tied together. But like the presence of conditional or not really isn't even what I think kicks in. I think it's that in spirit, someone should have written it so that their main and their exports are the same, right? Or have the same API. But in practice, they may not have. And so somebody may like you could easily have written a package that says my main is Node 12 and below. My exports dot is Node 13 and up. And I'm using syntax in my 13 and up piece that won't work in Node 12. So it's entirely possible that package could have been written that would then just suddenly break real hard in Node 12 if we backported the exports field. Now, I hope nobody wrote a package like that, but it's entirely possible.
I have not heard of anybody doing that so far.
I mean, I have, so other than my has package exports detection package, right? Like I have written a package called ES_get_iterator, which basically does terrible things in old browsers in order to reliably get an iterator interface. There's like stop iteration errors and all sorts of craziness. But I used conditional exports so that because I know which node version, like which node versions are the only ones that can get that entry point. And so that has a simpler implementation. But like I'm checking right now to see if I used fancy syntax in it, but at the moment, yeah, so I didn't, but I could have used like optional chaining, for example, and then like, you know, that, I don't know, something that works in node 13 but not 12. Probably not optional chaining, but I don't know, like it would have been really easy for me to have done that, because at the time I wrote that entry point, I was thinking, oh, these are the only versions of Node that can ever run this. Everyone else is
Sorry,
quiet. Oh, go for it.
Guy, if you're speaking, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you. Yeah, it's great to finally make a meeting again. Sorry, I've messed up time zones a couple of times in moving, so I haven't been able to quite work out the right time slot. This particular issue is something that we had a long session with James Snell with at Node.js Interactive, and discussing if landing exports would be a breaking change for CommonJS or Semper Major. And he seemed to think it was fine on the LTS branch. I thought that's just worth mentioning as a data point. Of course, there's risk. So the sooner if we're going to do it soon. Otherwise, don't do it. You know, where people are publishing about 10 packages with exports every day at the moment. It's going up super fast. There's over 500 packages with the exports field now. I mean, we could potentially just go through that data set and check that it's not breaking on that data set as well. I don't know how easy that is, but someone once, I've got a gist with all the packages with exports. One could just literally run through them, require them in Node 12 with exports unflagged, and then see if we want to be that careful. Otherwise, just throw it out and see what happens. But it's probably good to be careful if we have the ability to be careful, and if people are willing to put in the time to be careful.
Anyone else have thoughts here at all? So I guess like two different things that we can think about here would be, you know, the only packages that would have any like behavioral changes would be packages where the package author has explicitly opted into this new functionality. CommonJS modules that are reached through through an exports field would, you know, continue to have the same interface. There are some edge cases where things can break. I do think like one of the benefits here though would be that like any packages that do have things that break unexpectedly should be able to fix whatever is broken in the exports in a patch release, and without, you know, like too much, like it is not at least, and maybe this is famous last words, but my gut is that it's not going to be like a significant undertaking for module authors to fix this. And the modules that will have any change in behavior here are ones that are adopting like cutting edge experimental features in Node. So I think there is something to be said, at least in my own impression, that it is not likely that these are going to be extremely deep in people's module graphs in ways that are unreachable, because it is code that has been written more recently, and that those who are adopting it are more likely to have like a fast cadence in fixing problems if they arise. That's at least my personal opinion. You know, we could find out the hard way. But kind of based on this, does anyone block the idea of landing this in 12 with the warning intact, and with I guess with the caveat that, you know, we're aiming for an October-ish date of removing the warning around when like 14 goes into LTS. But if we have large ecosystem outcry or, you know, technical reasons to revisit this decision, that we can handle that pragmatically and approach the TSC to do it sooner if we need to. Is everyone okay with that? Okay, I hear no objections. So I think that that is what we can move forward on. So let's go back to the previous agenda item that we didn't get to, because we're waiting for Guy, which is the dev flag for development exports resolution condition. Guy, do you want to introduce this one?
Sure. So I guess this is in many ways something that's incredibly useful for bundlers, and it's you know, the standard pattern that React has, where it's got an index file and it checks process.environment.node environment equal to production, and then it exports from a production file. Otherwise, it exports from a development build. So there are two separate files. And the alternative to this kind of approach, so that there's two things that happen with these environment variables. One, it's determining the graph itself. And two, you also have dead code elimination that can happen when you're checking these dev conditions in if statements. And one of the benefits of doing it at the graph level is that every time you import a module, you import all the side effects of all its dependencies. So if you even just have a section that's like within an if statement, if you've got the import at the top for a dependency that's used by it, you still have to include dependencies if they have side effects. And most dependencies aren't pure packages or pure modules. So bundlers would still struggle to remove the dev code on those branches. You can do techniques to get around this. The alternative is basically await a dynamic import. So you have an if statement on your development condition, dynamically import your development dependencies with the top level await. And it's one of the nice things that's enabled by top level await. And then you can use that dev dependency and have your dev code in a specific branch. There's two problems. One, we don't have top level await yet. It's taking its time. And two, it's something that no bundlers support yet because they haven't had to. So there's also complexities on the bundler side in terms of how well they'll be able to support that pattern. So by doing it at the graph level, you get all these benefits of just immediately, you don't have to go through any of the dependencies or do pure analysis on dependencies or any of that. You can just immediately just have two builds and you're switching between those builds. And that's very much a benefit that conditional exports can bring, that you just have these two separate builds. It's the reason why we don't do all of the features of conditional exports through if statements in a single code file. So if you want to point to a specific development build, it's a development condition. And then the question is, well, we've got interest from bundlers. So Webpack are interested in it. And I believe, I'm not sure actually if Rollup are keen. I must discuss with them further. But at least Tobias is interested to implement it for now. And then the question is this something that we put in Node itself? And by putting it in Node, we can try and push bundlers, or at least set a precedent for bundlers that allows them to understand the meaning of this and have sort of a general universal way of handling this. So is it something that should go in Node? And if it does go in Node, how should Node turn it on? And what else should it enable? So right now it's a flag. After a few iterations for consensus, it's a flag when you run Node, and setting that flag will always run the development condition in conditional exports, which can also nest because conditions can nest. So you can nest it with browser or nest it with Node. And then the only thing that we're struggling with at the moment is if we should reflect this information in a variable as well within the execution environment. And this is a tricky one, firstly, because it's very difficult to get consensus in Node on it. Some people want things on process. Some people want it to be very general for all conditions, like a lookup. Some people want it to be a global specifier, and others want it to be an import. And I think one of the driving motivations behind this is that it should be well, at least it's trying to be something that can be adopted universally. And one of the problems there is we simply don't have a pattern for universal environment variables apart from globals, and adding a new global really isn't an option. So it's almost like we're stuck with the platform issues there, that that there's no way to set an environment variable in the browser apart from just setting a global, and no one is going to let us just set an arbitrary global unless we make a process or something like that. So that's a tricky one. And then, so for now, I've just set it up without the environment variable, and it would be nice to merge them over time. We can add other features, like Node.js can have more features related to its development mode that slowly add on. And that would be my ideal. And then from a consensus perspective, other people are concerned that it should be more about having generic condition management, and maybe less concerned about the universal use cases, which are really the driving motivation for me with this stuff as well. All that to say, is everyone happy to land it?
We've got Wes up first.
So I'm going to speak a little bit from experience here. Node's conditional exports in the resolver is not the first JavaScript runtime to have conditional exports. React Native Resolution for each platform that it runs on essentially already does conditional exports. And I will tell you from experience, it is absolutely terrible from a tooling perspective, because you have to run individual builds for every platform, which creates an exponential explosion in the amount of things that can run. Because of that, I can only recommend that people actually never use conditions unless absolutely necessary, because the conceptual complexity of what can actually execute explodes. As such, while I understand we added conditional exports solely for compatibility reasons, I would much rather recommend people actually never use it for anything else.
Are you saying, Wesley, that you would rather advocate top-level await patterns for conditional dependencies and ensure we get widespread bundler support for that?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Wes. Brad is next.
So I wanted to bring some additional context on why this is being talked about a little bit more prevalently right now. So this occurred in part because people creating React have a variety of development feature flags, essentially. When you enable the development mode, a variety of side effects occur. It is not purely about the implementation being altered. They don't actually change their exported APIs, but they do expose certain things so that dev tools are able to hook into them. I think, at least to my knowledge, that is the primary intended sort of use case here, is to enhance implementations with maybe more verbose forms. I think there is something to be said about the difficulty in understanding which implementation is about to be picked up. However, if we do implement the feature flags like top-level await would allow, that seems to also necessarily have your tooling take both branches of the feature flag to understand what's going on. I'm not sure, at least in the use case that I've heard this being used for, having tooling need to parse JavaScript and control flow graphs is simpler than any alternative. That's it.
Jordan, you're next.
Yeah, just it feels really weird to put this feature in here. Like the conditional exports at the moment are selecting between like module systems, essentially import require. The fact that it says node and default, right? Like that's, you could argue as well, they're selecting between platforms, right? Like that the node one, paves the way to add a browser one or Deno or whatever. But development and production are like a matrix you apply to each of those environments. And it seems like it just doesn't seem right to me to conflate them in the same object. I'm sure we could come up with a schema that would avoid that issue where it's like, because currently you can nest like node, and then like have something, right? So like we could avoid the nesting or something and just be like, your object can only have a development or a production key or a default key, or I don't know, something. Like we can come up with a solution there, but it really seems overly prescriptive, and in general, the way that people do development versus production specific builds, it's something that a few major frameworks do, but I wouldn't necessarily consider it a good thing. It's weird and unfortunate that React behaves differently in production than it does in development. And they do it for performance, not like because it's better. So I would rather see a world where React can make one build and not a world that makes it easier for them to make multiples. And to Wes's comment, by what I mean is like a world where their behavior in development and production is the same. So instead of making it easier to pivot on environment, I would rather like find ways to remove the need to do that.
Wes?
Right. So specifically on the subject of React, the next version of React to handle the dev mode versus prod mode swap, they took over the transform for JSX and emit an entirely different import and an entirely different transform in dev mode versus prod mode at build time. Ergo, they need no runtime switching.
That sounds like a very unique solution to React, though, as opposed to solving the problem for all libraries.
Oh, it is.
And that doesn't fix it if you're using React without JSX, which has always been a supported use case. So that
this is true. But like the point is, like for the super high performance use cases, for the people who actually really do care, they actually already have a solution.
So one of the, I guess it's worth not thinking of this as one solution. I think both conditional branching in code on environment conditions and conditional exports are tools. And I don't think we have to think in terms of absolutes here. Some publishers want to optimize their code for the target environment, and they can make much deeper optimizations than the average build tool because maybe they have their own build tools or they have a very particular configuration. The common catch when people build React apps is that they don't know to set process.environment.node environment, and they can end up building two versions of React and get double the code size. So these are real problems that we have today. Can you trust the bundler on the user side? And if you're a package author, that cares a lot about how your performance and how users use your package, you're going to want to optimize. I mean, I'm not saying this is for everyone, but if you are, a team like React, optimizing for target environments with as many optimizations as possible with Google Closure, all these things, is going to get you the best performance out of your package and for your users. And in that case, you're going to end up with a build per environment. So you're going to want to link those builds per environment. And conditional exports basically is tailored to this use case of people optimizing their packages for the environments before publishing. It's not to say that every publisher has to do that. I mean, I wish every publisher did that, but the fact of the world is they don't. But if they do, conditional exports with these features is the way to do it.
Wes, you still have your hand up. Is that from before? Great. And then Guy, you had your hand up. Was that just your response there, or do you have more to add? And take your silence. Is that you're
Sorry,
good?
yeah, that was everything. Sorry, just messing around with Windows here.
All good. Jan, it's on you.
Yeah, the one thing that I wanted to add here is I don't see the development build as something that allows more optimized production builds and more as a feature that allows more helpful development builds. And as such, I don't think it's unfortunate because it doesn't preclude you from maintaining your current package that doesn't have any development verbosity at all and no help for people who are currently, there's no debug features in most packages because right now it's really expensive and non-standard to add debug features to a package. And this allows packages to have a relatively safe and clear way to say, I can control when my debug features are visible, and I can say, hey, I can add more helpful debug features to my package because I can tell very clearly that this code will only be running on development machines and not be included in production. So I can make a more helpful package without risking getting on some bad blame lists for packages that blow the production deploys. So I think the opportunity for me is more on the side of, can packages become more helpful because of this feature, and not can packages become smaller because of this feature.
Brad?
So maybe it would be useful for us to view the alternatives to better understand if this is a good direction given the current ecosystem. So currently we have a kind of standard way of doing things of this nature with using a variable process.env.node.env, and some bundlers do support it. Some tools do support it. But it's a bit of a pain to parse. It also, if you use some syntax, is just not picked up, which we've had concerned with other places in this group. But even if you use it, you end up with a similar problem that we've been talking about of not wanting two different builds or two different things, where you have a conditional branch that's only executed in one mode. So you alter things between the two modes. And so when you do things like what React does with dev tools, what we have at work for a dev tool we use, is you expose things that you never want exposed in production. People might use them in production if you're in the case of React, but we wouldn't at our work. These things aren't merely for, production builds. There are some things you never want to be on your consumer facing site. For example, it's a similar situation here. We have things that we want when we are the application runner. However, we run other people's code as well. We don't want them to do stuff with it. When we're running it for our own development purposes, running it with this development flag seems like a good boon to me. It's something we don't really have in Node itself. You kind of have it if you do that if-else branching stuff, but it may not work with tooling. So I don't think there's a clear alternative path except telling people they shouldn't do what they want to do if we're saying that having two different modes of operation is problematic. I want those two different modes of operation, but I don't see a clear winner versus this route. If somebody could explain like why they think an alternative would be better, or exactly what this feature causes that an alternative doesn't also suffer from, it would be helpful to me. Because right now it seems like we're just kind of moving the stick around.
Wes, and then I think that we should set a time box on this for the next 5 minutes because we had a couple other agenda items that would be good to get to.
So as an immediate follow-up, yes, it does feel like we're just moving the stick around because we are in fact just moving where the branch happens from explicitly in code today to implicitly in a loader. Explicitly in code today is something a handful of tools already supports. In a loader, nothing supports right now, but we're assuming it's better because reasons. Now, secondly, there is a problem that makes it so this actually isn't particularly safe to do, and that's that exports only apply to external references to things. So let's say you do specify different dev and prod entry points to your package. Internally, within your package, assuming you haven't bundled your entire package to only one file, none of those conditions are going to be applied. And so unless you actually have two completely independent trees, where you like, I have my dev package and my prod package sitting in completely different folder structures and never do the two talk, you're very liable to, in your development entry point, call back into your prod entry point, or in your prod entry point, call into your dev entry point. And that can be very unintentional. And yes, you could use self-referential internally to try and prevent this, but like self-referential internally is far from common right now.
So I completely disagree with the explicitness thing. The location in which it's placed is still explicit, even if we change it to be some sort of out-of-band file.
So, Guy, you have your hand up, and then I think we should move on to the next topic.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it seems from what Tobias has said, it seems like he probably will implement this in conditional exports in Webpack. And the fact that proposing it was enough to see that he was already interested in it shows me that this is a need in bundlers. And if Webpack supports it, it gets a large amount of user base. So I think the question here is really, does Node want to support it? I don't think we have control over whether it's going to exist, because it will exist. And if we can help our users by implementing it, and it sounds like we're not going to implement it today, which is a shame. But when we do implement it, hopefully it can help users.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, for the in-depth conversation. Guy, is this something we should keep on the agenda to discuss again the next meeting, or should we take it off the agenda for now?
We can come back to it in about a month, I think.
Okay, so if you could remove the level, the label, that'd be great. So the last thing that we have on here for right now that I think we should look at, because we have 9 minutes left, this is going to maybe get tight, but it's the rediscussion for out of order CJS exec. Does anybody want to take time to introduce this one? No one volunteered. I'll go ahead and do it.
Isn't it Guy's issue?
Yeah. Guy, do you want to?
Miles, please go ahead.
So the TLDR here is, as of today, importing CommonJS is supported, but not with named exports. So the rediscussion is actually maybe a bit of burying the lead. The high level bit I think is worth discussing is like, just straight up from a problem standpoint, like, is the problem of named exports from CommonJS modules something that we want to solve? I know that folks have feelings about making behavior for, as we call them, faux modules, making a smaller delta between our implementation and that. Then there are a number of different solutions that we could explore. One being out of order execution of CJS, another being static analysis of CJS, another being a double execution. But what I think is probably the best use of our time for the next 8 minutes, without getting too much into the weeds, to the solutions of the problem. I think we should reach consensus on if this is a problem space we even want to continue to dig into. We had at least it seemed to be a degree of consensus around this. Dynamic modules in the spec was another thing that we discussed, although, like, to be honest, I don't think that really has legs, but just like there's a number of different solutions to this space that we've tried to explore. Is this a problem space we want to revisit independent of the solution that we use? Guy, you have your hand up, then Jeffrey, then Brad.
Sorry, I still had my hand up from before. Jeffrey, you can go ahead.
My answer would be yes. I think that users are complaining about this, and this is like clearly a big pain point. I think that, like, even if we never ship anything better than what we have today, we need to like show some more effort in saying why this is the best we can do. And I think like the only way to do that is to, give a good faith effort to the best possible solution we can come up with for what named exports would be, and test it and see how good or bad it would be. Like, does it catch 99% of cases or not? Or, and then at least we have something we can point to for why we didn't do anything, or if it seems good enough, then we run with it. But that to me feels like the next step, and kind of what we need to do before we make any, like, quote unquote final decisions.
Okay, Brad, and then Jan, and then if there's time, I'd like to add something.
Sure. I think my priority here is we're seeing a lot of people having problems transitioning their modules. I want to make a reevaluation of this on how to allow an easier transition for some subset of people. I honestly don't think we can reach 100% coverage for everything. But I will state that I am very against the reordered solution vector. It has a lot of weird effects, and no tool does it currently. At least for static analysis, there are some tools that exist, so we could understand what they're doing and what's wrong.
Okay, Jan?
Yeah. I think I slightly disagree with we need to write code at this point, because I don't think that, I think we understand how well the different approaches would work for the different kinds of packages. And we know that to the extent that we have documented, they do work. And so far, the objections have rarely been, at least from what I've seen, hey, this wouldn't work to the degree that it's promising to work. It's more that people have objected to the degree that it could possibly work. So the objection was not that parsing would never work or that it doesn't work for enough packages. The objection was that parsing would introduce a heuristic, and we don't want to have a heuristic subset of perfectly valid CommonJS code be treated as named exports. And that objection cannot be really resolved by writing code, because whatever code you write, arguably the more code you write, the less convincing it is, because the more complicated is the heuristic, and the more arguments you're providing that it should not be used, because it is even more of a heuristic if the objection is maintained as valid. So I think I do strongly agree that we should make a decision and decide whether we care about some level of support for exports. And we know that no level of support for named exports from CommonJS will ever be truly what exists today, just because that's not how bindings work. You can't dynamically add a binding late at runtime. Like, that exists in CommonJS modules, especially ones that have cycles. So there's just a limit. There exists CommonJS modules that have an index.js that just re-exports. Like, for example, I look at this Express. Express has an index.js that is just modular exports equals require lib index. Well, it has only a default export if you just pass this one file. So if Express already doesn't work with parsing directly, I don't think we need to implement it to tell. And yes, we can then say, hey, Express just needs to make a change to work with this parsing approach. But at that point, is it really that much more work to add an MJS wrapper around the index? If they have to make it anyhow. So I think we know the trade-offs. We need to decide if those trade-offs are worth it for the usability gains. And that's just a decision to be made at some level.
Thanks, Guy. So I'm going to add something really quickly. I'll just drop this in the chat. It's a pull request that I started working on yesterday. This pull request hooks into the loading phase, and when a module fails for importing a named export, it checks to see if the module that you imported from is a CommonJS module, gives a better warning, including actual code that you can copy and paste to replace your named imports that will just work using the exact named imports and specifier that you used. It is suffice to say that the regular expressions in here maybe need a little bit of thinking, and there's a lot of testing that we need to do before landing it. But kind of to Jan's point and what we're going at here, like, I do think another approach here, at least in the meantime, if we don't have consensus, is definitely improving the documentation and improving the errors to make sure that, like, when things break, they let people know explicitly what broke, why it broke, and then give them kind of like the solution to improve it. I think that I'm leaning personally towards where Jan is, although I would be lying if I said I wasn't flip-flopping. I want to improve the experience for folks that are trying to move towards modules. But at the same time, the kind of clear cut, you have a default and that's it for CommonJS, unless you write an explicit wrapper, is easy to teach people. It is easy to understand. It does not require, like if we were doing the static analysis solution, an understanding of like when modules are static, when they're dynamic, when things would work, when they wouldn't work. It just seems cleaner. I realize that it's important for us to remain pragmatic here, so I've not made a decision. But I just want to state that I do feel like I'm leaning towards, you know, not adding this feature. Jan just wanted to say that his position is that parse is viable, but not strong enough to put the work in, I'm guessing himself. We are at time, so I want to give the folks that have their hands up the opportunity to add their thoughts quickly, but I'm going to hopefully time box you all to a minute so we don't run over too much. Jan, did you have anything else to add, or is that it? Great.
No.
Wes, if you're speaking, you're muted right now.
Oh, I thought Guy was up next. I forget what I was going to say. Never mind.
Cool. Guy?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I'm probably leaning towards wanting to implement this. I thought we were going to get away with it with just the defaults. But it's clear that all bundlers and all tools and dev servers and all these things are going to continue to support named exports for CommonJS modules. So it's going to be very much a continual friction where users will probably, if they're developing in the browser and then they move to Node or any type of universal scenario, they're always going to keep hitting this. And especially seeing the amount of times it's come up recently, I think it can be worthwhile to just mitigate that pain. I think parsing works. The biggest concern to me was doing it for every CommonJS module loaded, but it seems like we've got an agreement to only do it on the boundary with ES modules, in which case the performance loss is contained, and it's likely only, in theory, it can be under a millisecond a module. With JavaScript parsers, it'll probably be a few milliseconds per module. If we were able to bring in a C++ parser, we could get it down. So I'm tempted to say that we should do it. And I would like to ask if we have consensus to do it. And if not, what can we do to get consensus to do it?
So considering we're close to the end of the meeting, I think we should kick this off back to the issue to have the discussion of consensus, if you don't mind, Guy, because I don't think we have time to sort that out in this call.
But specifically, if I put in development time over the next 2 weeks, I would like to know if we have any clear objectives.
I am leaning -0 right now, so I'm not saying that I would object it, but I need more time to think about it before I could give a clear signal that I would definitely be in support of this.
And I think there were people on the issue tracker that made relatively strong objections that might not be on this call.
I think Gus
So
might
even if
object.
we agree.
Well,
Is there anyone else interested in working on it? That was the other thing I wanted to ask before we run out of time. Just so we can coordinate that.
Quickly, if before somebody runs off to work on it, my big concern is default, because my answer very strongly depends on what the story is for the default export. Because by definition right now, we have a collision with module.exports.default and module.exports for some of those modules. And if we actually are targeting to be consistent and compatible with full module implementation, full modules will treat module.exports.default as the default, which is a breaking change from what we are currently doing for existing modules. So there's a pretty big question mark on that front.
What I would suggest, Guy, right now, at least for myself, would be perhaps close the issue that we have right now, because that it's long and its topic was something else. I think that we should make a new issue that is explicitly about like the named exports, with more or less the equivalent of an RFC of what you plan to implement. And we should try to build some consensus around that before you start implementation, because I want to be respectful of your time. I recognize that on the Node project, code speaks, but I don't think that we have the consensus yet that can be a strong signal that investing your time right now would not be for nothing. I think we're close, but I would be dismayed if you put in all this time and then it didn't work out.
Okay, I could a full sort of RFC for what the implementation would involve and what the sort of touch points of it are. And maybe we can then keep that on the agenda for next time.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think, and we could even, like, I don't think that this is so time sensitive that we need to do something out of band, but like, if you feel that we should, that's something we could explore as well. But I think that, especially for this one, because it's kind of controversial within the group, I think it would be good to scope it and build consensus around that first.
I think the only time critical aspect would be the Node 12 support. And ideally we could, because if we support modern Node with this and then suddenly it breaks in Node 12, that's a problem.
Mm-hmm. And I actually think a really good reason to talk about timing here would be if this is something we want in before we unflag, but I feel like this is something that needs to live on current a little bit first. And it's also something that arguably is semver minor because it's adding a feature. But let's kick it off to an issue. We've run over by 7 minutes. I did not do a good job of scoping this. So thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to go ahead and kill the stream. Thanks for watching those who did of scoping this. The stream is